Hi, this is a video showing and reviewing the impact of the Kansas Nebraska Act, which shifted us away from compromise, specifically the Missouri Compromise, and towards civil war. It all starts back in 1853 with the purchase of a small strip of land on the current southern border of Arizona and New Mexico called the Gadsden Purchase. The South was hoping that this land would provide a possible route for a southern transcontinental rail line. When they purchased this line, this upped the ante for Northerners now to further develop Northern territory for the development of a Northern line. This was especially important to a senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas, who wanted the line to go through his home city of Chicago. So he pushes, if he knows that the only way he's going to get a bill that's going to be approved by Southerners to pass through the North is if he can develop the Kansas Nebraska Act. And to get Southern support for that bill, he was going to have to make some kind of concession on slavery. And that is what leads to the Kansas Nebraska Act. In 1854, the Nebraska Territory, right in here, is reorganized into two chunks, the Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory. And slavery in those regions would now be determined by popular sovereignty. Even though the Missouri Compromise stipulated that no slaves were allowed above the line of 3630, this new law superseded that and said that slavery would be allowed north of that line. One of the political consequences of this bill, it so upset many people in the North that it led to the birth of a new party, the Republican Party, which was born in 1854. Now, the Republican Party is mostly pushing an old free soil position that slavery should not be allowed to extend into any territories. It was made up of Northern Whigs, Northern Democrats, free soilers, know-nothings, and other miscellaneous opponents of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the immediate impact of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is that it led to a very strong competition for Kansas. Now that popular sovereignty would determine the fate of Kansas, many people would flood into Kansas to try to make sure that their side, whether it be pro-slave or anti-slave, would have the advantage come the time for a territorial government vote. This leads to an event known as Bleeding Kansas. In the first election, there are a group of Missourians who cross the border and vote illegally in Kansas and influence the outcome of the vote so that a new government is a pro-slave government that is approved in the city of Shawnee Mission. The next election, actually what happens is that the Free Staters realize this is a fraudulent election, so they ignore it and they create a second government of Kansas, this time established in the city of Topeka. And this really begins a conflict over who is and who is not the true government of Kansas. One of the events that now raises the stakes even further is the destruction of the city of Lawrence, the sacking of Lawrence by pro-slave people. Lawrence was a free state city. And then eventually John Brown comes to Kansas to try to attack pro-slave people, and he does so at a place called Pottawatomie Creek, where he kills 5 pro-slavery men at their homes. This shows that the conflict is becoming increasingly violent, and Bleeding Kansas will ultimately result in about 300 deaths and a preview of the Civil War. Meanwhile, back in the U.S. Senate, abolitionist Charles Sumner ridicules South Carolina Senator Andrew P. Butler, making fun of him and offending his honor. In response, Sumner's, and again, the issue here was slavery. Sumner had accused Butler of taking up a mistress, and that mistress's name was slavery. And in response, Butler's nephew, a man named Preston Brooks, attacks Sumner mercilessly with a cane in something now referred to as Bleeding Sumner. So this shows you that even on the Senate floor, the crisis over Nebraska was becoming more and more, and Kansas was becoming more and more violent. Afterwards, James Buchanan wins the election for president in 1856, and he will prove to be a relatively ineffective leader. The Dred Scott decision is passed the following year, and in this decision, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney rules that Dred Scott was not a citizen, therefore could not sue. He also rules that the Missouri Compromise was and had always been unconstitutional because the Fifth Amendment prohibited the restrictions on slaves being carried into the territories. He also went on to say that the Constitution and the country, the government, had no obligation to respect any rights of African American people. Meanwhile, a popular book named Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This book sensationalized the issue of slavery. It sold over 300,000 copies in 1 year, and it turned a lot of people who had been ambivalent about slavery into abolitionists. Following that, back in Kansas, when it was time for a state government, there was a fraudulent election of a new constitution called the Lecompton Constitution. James Buchanan endorsed this constitution even though he and most other people realized that this did not meet the desires of most people living in Kansas, most of whom actually approved a free state of Kansas. This also carries over into the conflict, the debate between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is forced to make a decision between popular sovereignty or Dred Scott, and this is pushed on him by Lincoln in these debates. And the Freeport Doctrine, Stephen Douglas says that if the people of a territory do not choose to enforce slavery, no matter what the Dred Scott decision says, slavery will not exist in that territory and popular sovereignty will reign supreme. This causes many Southerners to turn away from Stephen Douglas and ultimately splits the Democratic Party into two, the Northern and Southern Democrats, in the election of 1860. And the consequence of this, of course, is that Abraham Lincoln is able to win the election, and once he wins the election, the South will secede from the Union in protest. At least 7 of the states will secede from the Union immediately following the election and before Lincoln even takes office. And that, of course, ultimately leads to the Civil War.